Picture this. It's mid-afternoon, somewhere in ancient northern Europe, around 30,000 years ago, and something mildly absurd is happening near the edge of camp. A young man is working on a scraper tool, carefully striking flint with a specific rhythm he's been practicing for months, trying to get the edge geometry exactly right. Nearby, his group's resident wolf dog, one of those semi-domesticated proto-dogs that have been living on the edge of human camps for several generations, is watching him with an attention that's almost unsettling in its focused quality. Then the man stops to eat something, breaking off a piece of dried meat and putting it in his mouth with a specific hand motion. The wolf dog makes an almost identical jaw movement a moment later, for no particular reason, eating nothing, connected to nothing immediately in front of it, apparently just doing the motion because a human just did the motion. The man notices. He does the motion again, deliberately this time, watching the animal. The wolf dog does it again. Both of them sit with this discovery for a moment, finding it interesting. Then the man goes back to his scraper, and the animal goes back to watching him work. And nobody has any conceptual framework for what just happened. What just happened, it turns out, is one of the more significant cognitive behaviors in the entire animal behavioral repertoire, and it connects to something much larger about why the relationship between humans and animals evolved the way it did across the ancient era. So here's the actual question this video exists to investigate. Why do animals copy us? Not metaphorically, not loosely, but specifically, cognitively, in ways that researchers have documented with controlled methodology. Why do animals imitate human behavior, sometimes very specifically, and sometimes across genuinely surprising timescales and distances from the original behavior? The answer reaches into the deepest questions about animal social learning, the specific history of the human-animal relationship across the ancient era, and some surprisingly unsettling implications about how much the behavioral gap between humans and other animals is narrower than most people assume. Stick around, because this story goes considerably deeper than dogs sometimes mimic their owners' internet content, and the ancient human dimension of it changes the framing entirely. The imitation question deserves careful framing from the beginning because there are multiple distinct cognitive processes that can produce behavior resembling imitation, and distinguishing between them matters enormously for understanding what's actually happening when an animal copies a human. The most cognitively shallow version is stimulus enhancement, where an animal's attention is simply drawn to a specific location or object by observing another animal interacting with it, producing increased behavior around that object without any actual copying of the specific action observed. A dog watching you interact with a container might investigate the container simply because your interaction directed its attention there without copying the specific way you opened it. More sophisticated is emulation, where an animal observes the outcome of another's behavior and figures out how to achieve that outcome independently, without necessarily copying the specific actions used. An animal watching you open a box to get food inside might open the box by an entirely different method, understanding that the goal is accessing the contents rather than reproducing your specific action sequence. Both stimulus enhancement and emulation are forms of social learning that are broadly distributed across many animal species and don't require the highest levels of cognitive sophistication. True imitation, copying the specific method of another's behavior rather than simply being attracted to its target or reproducing its outcome, requires considerably more. It requires the observer to form a representation of the specific actions performed, map those actions onto their own body and motor system, and execute them in a way that reproduces not just the outcome but the method. This is cognitively demanding in ways that stimulus enhancement and emulation are not, requiring something like theory of body in addition to the theory of mind that various other social cognitive tasks require. An understanding that the other individual's body and your own body are analogous, systems that can execute analogous actions. When researchers test for true imitation specifically, controlling for stimulus enhancement and emulation, effects by using procedures where copying the specific method produces no better outcome than using any other method, the species list that passes narrows considerably. Great apes, especially chimpanzees and orangutans, show true imitation in well-controlled conditions. Dolphins demonstrate it. Certain corvids show evidence of it. Dogs are interesting and contested, with some researchers finding evidence of true imitation and others arguing that what looks like imitation in dogs is better explained through emulation and other lower level social learning processes. The human case is, predictably, the most extreme. Human children not only imitate readily and specifically, they do something that no other species does to anything approaching the same degree. They over-imitate, copying actions that are demonstrably irrelevant to achieving the observed goal. In experiments where children watch a person use a specific sequence of unnecessary actions before opening a box to retrieve a reward, children reproduce those unnecessary actions even when they can see they're unnecessary, even when they could get the reward more efficiently without them. Chimpanzees and other apes in identical experiments typically skip the unnecessary steps, going directly to what works. Human children copy the whole sequence, apparently operating on the principle that if a trusted adult is doing something this way, there's probably a reason even if the reason isn't currently visible. This human tendency toward over-imitation is fascinating because it's not a cognitive limitation but a specific, apparently adaptive behavior that produces extraordinary benefits in cultural learning contexts where the unnecessary steps might carry meaning or importance that isn't immediately visible to a naive observer. Reproducing the full observed sequence, including apparently irrelevant components, is an excellent strategy in a world where procedural knowledge often carries critical but non-obvious steps, where ritual and process are meaningful beyond their immediate outcomes, and where trusting the full transmitted behavior of experienced group members is a reliable path to acquiring sophisticated skills that would take much longer to develop independently. In the ancient context, this over-imitation tendency in human children almost certainly drove the remarkably high fidelity of cultural transmission across generations that made accumulated human knowledge such a powerful force. A child who copies the full fire-making technique, including all the specific setup steps that seem unnecessary until the moment they become critical, learns fire-making more reliably than a child who skips the steps that don't seem immediately relevant. The same applies to tool-making, food preparation, hunting technique, and every other domain of ancient practical knowledge. Over-imitation is essentially the cognitive mechanism that makes high-fidelity cultural transmission possible, and it may be one of the most consequential specific cognitive tendencies in the entire human behavioral repertoire. Now, back to animals copying humans specifically. The evolutionary and ecological logic of why animals would develop any tendency to copy human behavior becomes considerably clearer when you place it against the backdrop of the ancient human world. Animals that regularly interacted with ancient human groups occupied an ecological environment where human behavior was a major, reliable, consequential source of information about what to do, where to find resources, how to navigate successfully, and what threats to avoid. In this context, paying close attention to human behavior and adjusting one's own behavior in response to it was adaptive, not as a specific evolved response to humans as a novel species, but as an extension of the general social learning systems that most cognitively sophisticated social animals already possessed. Dogs, or their proto-dog wolf ancestors in the process of becoming dogs, represent the most extreme and most consequential example of this dynamic in the ancient human story. We have discussed the ancient human-dog relationship across multiple earlier videos in this series, but the imitation and social learning dimension of it deserves dedicated attention here. The process by which wolves gradually became dogs involved selection for specific social cognitive traits, reduced fear, increased attentiveness to human behavioral signals, responsiveness to human communicative intent, and what appears to be a specific tuning of the wolf social learning system toward human behavior as a priority information source rather than primarily toward other wolves. Modern dogs demonstrate an attentiveness to human gaze direction, pointing gestures, and communicative signals that exceeds what chimpanzees, our much closer evolutionary relatives, show in equivalent situations. Dogs follow human gaze, and pointing to find hidden objects in ways that require genuine understanding of the communicative intent behind these signals, not just reflexive following of movement. This social attentiveness, calibrated specifically toward human behavioral signals, is almost certainly a domestication effect, Selected for over the thousands of generations during which wolves that paid closest attention to human behavior had the best access to the resources that living near human groups provided. Whether this constitutes true imitation or a more sophisticated version of social learning calibrated specifically toward humans is technically debated, but the practical behavioral outcome. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Dogs that watch humans carefully and adjust their own behavior based on what they observe was clearly advantageous in the ancient human camp environment and clearly became more pronounced as selection for this attentiveness progressed across the proto-domestication period. An ancient human living alongside a proto-dog companion, and noticing that the animal seemed to be picking up on behavioral patterns would have been observing a real phenomenon: the progressive calibration of canine social learning toward human behavior as a primary information source. Beyond dogs, various other species show documented tendencies to copy or respond to human demonstrated behavior in ways that are worth examining specifically. African gray parrots demonstrate referential learning from human demonstrators, not just reproducing sounds, but apparently learning the referential connections between words and objects by observing human behavior toward those objects. In captive settings, parrots have acquired vocabulary in ways that parallel aspects of human language acquisition rather than simple operant conditioning, suggesting that their social learning systems are capable of something more sophisticated than purely reward-driven training. Crows and other corvids have been documented adjusting their behavior in response to observed human behavior in the wild, in ways that appear to involve genuine social learning. Urban crows have been observed using human-created traffic patterns to crack nuts, placing nuts at pedestrian crossings and waiting for cars to crack them, then collecting the fragments during pedestrian crossing phases, a behavior that has spread across crow populations in cities where it was first observed. Whether this represents true imitation of observed human nut-cracking methods, independent invention, or some combination is debated, but the behavior demonstrates that corvid social learning systems are flexible enough to incorporate information from human behavioral environments in adaptive ways. Orcas show cultural transmission of hunting behaviors that appears to involve genuine imitation within family groups, and their demonstrated ability to learn human vocalizations in captive settings suggests a general vocal imitation capacity that can be directed toward human sounds as well as conspecific ones. The cultural transmission of specific hunting techniques across orca populations is itself a form of social learning that, while not imitation of human behavior specifically, demonstrates the same underlying capacity for observational learning that allows animals to copy human behavior when exposed to it. The ancient human context here matters in a specific way that often gets overlooked in discussions of animal imitation that focus on modern or captive settings. Ancient humans and the animals they regularly encountered existed in a long-term, multi-generational ecological relationship where animal populations had been observing human behavior and its consequences across many generations, not just across the lifetime of individual animals. Species that maintained regular ecological associations with ancient human groups across thousands of years had extensive generational experience with human behavioral patterns to draw on, transmitted through whatever social learning mechanisms each species possessed. Ravens following ancient hunting parties, watching the outcomes of different hunting strategies, observing which human behaviors predicted food availability, were potentially building population-level behavioral knowledge about human hunting activity that exceeded what any individual raven's lifetime experience could provide. The proto-dogs living near ancient camps were doing the same, with each generation of animals learning from both direct human interaction and from the behavioral models provided by older animals in their own group that had accumulated more experience with human behavioral patterns. This long-term, multi-generational character of the animal-human observation relationship in the ancient world means that the behavioral tendencies we observe in animals toward copying or responding to human behavior today aren't simply individual responses to novel stimuli. They're the products of long evolutionary and behavioral histories during which human behavior was a reliable, consequential, high quality information source, and paying close attention to it was consistently adaptive. The attentiveness to human behavior we observe in domestic animals and in some wild species with extensive human contact histories is a legacy of this ancient relationship rather than a novel response to modern circumstances. Something worth examining directly is why human behavior specifically would be such a valuable information source for other animals in the ancient world. Part of the answer is simply that ancient humans were extraordinarily competent ecological actors, possessing detailed knowledge of the landscape, its resources, its hazards, and its patterns that exceeded what any other species in the same environment had developed through its own species specific methods. Watching an ancient human, even without understanding the specific cognitive processes driving their behavior, provided useful information about where resources were, where dangers lay, what was worth paying attention to, and what could be safely ignored. An animal that had learned to follow ancient humans at a safe distance would have had access to resource information, water location, prey movement patterns, edible plant distribution that would have taken that animal's own foraging and exploration methods much longer to acquire independently. The information contained in human behavior was, in a sense, a free resource available to any animal capable of extracting it, and the animals best at extracting it, those most attentive, most capable of observational learning from human behavioral sequences, would have been best positioned to benefit from proximity to human groups. This creates an evolutionary logic for increased attentiveness to human behavior in species that regularly associated with ancient humans. An arms race of sorts, with animals that were better at reading and using human behavioral information, having survival advantages over conspecifics that were less attentive, gradually shifting population-level behavioral tendencies toward greater human attentiveness across the generations of the ancient era. The specific forms that animal copying of humans takes in documented cases reveal something about the aspects of human behavior that animals appear most sensitive to and most inclined to reproduce. Tool use is one category where animal copying of human demonstrated techniques has been most clearly documented in controlled settings, possibly because tool-mediated food access is a highly salient, high-value behavior category where the functional connection between action and outcome is clear enough to motivate close observation and reproduction attempts. Vocalization is another category where certain species, particularly parrots and certain cetaceans, show documented tendencies to copy human sounds, possibly because vocalization copying is itself adaptive in social contexts where shared vocal patterns function as social bonding and group identity signals. Social gestures and behavioral patterns are a third category where animal copying of human behavior shows up in documented ways that are sometimes striking. The mirroring behavior we described in our opening scenario, animals making similar movements to human demonstrators without apparent instrumental motivation, represents a form of behavioral resonance that appears across various animal species including dogs, primates, and certain birds. Whether this represents true imitation, automatic motor resonance, or social bonding through behavioral synchrony is technically debated, but the phenomenon is real, documented, and appears to reflect something about the social learning systems of animals that regularly observe human behavior. Something worth highlighting is the difference between animals copying human behaviors they observe in normal social contexts versus animals that have been specifically trained to reproduce demonstrated actions on command. The do-as-I-do training paradigm used with dolphins and some other species, where animals are trained to reproduce whatever action a human demonstrator performs, demonstrates impressive generalization capability, with trained animals reproducing novel actions they've never been reinforced for reproducing. But this trained copying is a different phenomenon from spontaneous behavioral adoption of human demonstrated techniques. And the latter is more directly relevant to the ancient human context where no deliberate training program existed, but animals still adjusted their behavior in response to human behavioral observation. The spontaneous adoption of human associated behaviors by wild or semi wild animals in the ancient context almost certainly happened through exactly the kind of casual, incidental observation opportunities that the daily proximity of animals to human camps provided. An animal watching an ancient human use a specific tool technique repeatedly, not in a training context, but simply because that's what humans in that camp did, would have had extensive observational learning opportunities with no deliberate teaching involved. Whether any given animal's social learning system was capable of translating those observations into behavioral adoption would have depended on that species' specific cognitive architecture, but the observation opportunities were there consistently across the ancient era. The most practically consequential aspect of the ancient human-animal relationship in this context was almost certainly the behavioral flexibility that animals capable of social learning from human observation were able to achieve. Species that could learn from human behavioral demonstrations, even imperfectly, could potentially access innovations that human cognitive capabilities had produced without having to independently develop those capabilities themselves. This represents a form of cognitive asymmetry exploitation, with animals leveraging the cognitive outputs of human intelligence to enhance their own adaptive repertoire, something that human cognitive capability made uniquely possible compared to what any other species in the same environment could offer as a behavioral model. The relationship this creates is interesting because it's not simple exploitation in one direction. Ancient humans benefiting from the ecological associations with attentive animal species, ravens signaling prey location, proto-dogs providing early warning, various other animals whose behavioral attentiveness to human activity made them useful ecological partners, were themselves benefiting from animal cognitive capabilities in ways that made the relationship genuinely bidirectional. Ancient humans were copying from animals too, observational learning from animal behavior about plant safety, water location, weather patterns, prey movement, representing exactly the same kind of behavioral information extraction from competent ecological actors that animals were doing in reverse. The ancient era of human-animal interaction was, in this light, an extended period of mutual behavioral influence, with both humans and various animal species adjusting their behavior in response to observation of the other, with the long-term product being the kinds of modified behavioral tendencies we see in modern domesticated and semi-domesticated species. The attentiveness to human behavior, the tendency to copy human actions, the calibration of social learning systems toward human behavioral signals as high-value information sources, all of these represent the accumulated behavioral legacy of an ancient era when being attentive to and capable of learning from human behavior was a significant adaptive advantage for any species fortunate enough to be cognitively capable of it. Why do animals copy us? Based on the evolutionary logic that positions human behavior as a high value information source for any species capable of extracting it. The specific domestication history that selected for human-directed attentiveness in certain species. The general social learning capabilities that many cognitively sophisticated species possess and that can be directed toward human behavioral demonstrations under appropriate conditions. And the long multi-generational history of animal-human ecological association in the ancient world that calibrated animal behavioral tendencies toward human behavioral observation. The answer is both simpler and more profound than most people expect. Animals copy us because, for an animal with the cognitive capability to do so, watching humans and learning from what they observe has been one of the most adaptive behavioral strategies available for tens of thousands of years. That's not flattery. That's ecology, and the ancient world is where it started.